So this will be recorded. So if the kids miss a meeting, they can watch it on the YouTube channel. So that's not a problem. It's also on our Vimeo channel, which doesn't have ads, which is a little nicer for the kids to use. So all the meetings will be recorded unless I forget. So if we get a meeting started and you think I'm forgetting to turn the recording on, just let me know. You really don't need to worry about responding with microphones. You can always respond by text in the text chat, and if you've got questions or would like to talk at the end of the meeting time, that's fine. But there's never going to be any requirement to talk if you don't want to or aren't able to. So don't worry about that. Students never have to worry about getting called on by the teacher. I don't like to do that, so you can just relax, enjoy the lesson. I posted on the chat in the waiting room that you should have some note paper and a pen or pencil to jot down some notes. Other than that, you can just relax. What I'm going to do, and again, we're just waiting for more students to come in. They're still showing up. What I'm going to do is walk you through these fables, and after we go through the fable, what you should do is just go on to the study center and complete the assignment for that fable, since you'll have all of the information fresh in your mind. So hopefully every time we have one of these meetings, you'll be able to go and complete one of the fables. And then as you get used to me going through them, it'll make it easier for you to do them yourselves. Yes, because the George asked about the lessons being further ahead. It doesn't really matter what order you do Aesop's fables in. So what I'm going to do in these meetings is I'm going to talk about fables that are further along in the course, so it's helpful for everyone, even students who are further along. I'll talk about that in a minute when we get started. So we're up to 33. 105, we'll get started. One more minute. Hello, Margaret. And just remember, if you have any problems with your headphones or anything like that, the meeting's recorded, so just relax. You can work out those problems later on. But as long as you can hear the lesson, that's all you should really be worried about right now. No, actually, Cecilia, we're going to start with the birds, the beasts, and the bat. That was the last one we left off with last year. The birds, the beasts, and the bat. I'm not sure what number that is off the top of my head, but it's on page 92 in that Aesop's Fables document. All right, so it's 1:05. We'll get started now. And again, if you've got any technical problems, as long as you can hear me, as long as you can see the chat and hear me, that's fine. You can work out technical issues over the course of the next week. And after a week or two, all that stuff will get sorted out. But all of these meetings will be recorded. So even if something's not working, you don't have to panic and try to fix it immediately. Just relax, enjoy the lesson, watch the recording if you miss anything, and take the next week to get technical stuff figured out. All right, good. So Rebecca says that her sound is working now, so that's good. Okay, so if you're new around here, my name is William Michael. You can call me Mr. Michael, even though that sounds strange because I have two first names, but Mr. Michael is my name. And in these meetings on Tuesdays, I'd like to help you study Aesop's Fables because the course is intended for younger students, even though it's open for students of all ages and good for students of all ages. It's It's usually recommended for young students, and the young students have trouble sometimes understanding the moral lessons and thinking about how they apply to their lives. So I like to go through these fables with students and help them for a number of reasons. The reason why Aesop's fables are so important is because they're not just stories that are interesting to read. They're not just funny stories. They're not just cute stories for children. They actually teach us very important moral lessons, and they help to prepare us for other studies. They help to prepare us for the study of sacred scripture. They prepare us for future philosophy studies. They help us to understand history. They help us to understand what's going on around us in modern events that we see in our lives, because they introduce us to important moral principles. They introduce us to important moral lessons. And once we learn these lessons, we can begin to see them all around us every day. And so it helps us to pay attention to important moral lessons. So that's why Aesop's fables are so important. And what's also interesting about Aesop's fables is you might wonder, if we want to teach people about morals, if I want to teach children about moral lessons for their lives, why would somebody make up stories about animals talking or animals doing all kinds of things that animals can't do? Why would that possibly be the way that someone chooses to teach moral lessons? Doesn't that make it seem fake, right? If we have some kind of cartoon characters teaching lessons, it seems kind of fake. It doesn't seem like it's serious if we're using all of these crazy stories. But the truth is, these fables, the stories of these animals and things like that, first of all, they're entertaining, they're enjoyable to read, so that it's pleasant. It's like a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down. Telling these funny stories, telling these interesting stories is like using cartoons. Everyone loves cartoons. They're just enjoyable and funny. So if we can teach moral lessons using a form of writing that people enjoy, it's like I said, it's like a spoonful of sugar that helps the medicine go down. We can teach the moral lesson through these fables, but also once we teach the moral lesson, they're very easy to remember. It's easy to remember these stories. For example, if I were to ask you, have any of you heard of the story of the tortoise and the hare? Most people will say yes, because once you hear the story and once you get the image in your mind of a rabbit and a turtle having a race, and the rabbit being fast and the turtle just moving along slowly, but in the end, the turtle wins because the rabbit's crazy and runs all over the place. Once you get that story in your head and get that image in your head, you never forget it. And that's another reason why the fables are so helpful. Not only do they teach us important lessons, but they're enjoyable and they're very easy to remember. And when we teach other people, when we're the teachers and we teach other people, one of the challenges is that we don't only want to teach them something important, we also want them to keep it with them. We want it to stick when they walk away from us. So fables help us to do that. A good proof that fables and stories like this are wise methods of teaching is the fact that when God came into the world, if we ask the question, how would God teach us if he was a man? If God became a man and walked around on earth, how would he teach us? Would he write poetry? Would he sing songs? Would he give sermons, from a podium? What would God do if he was a man and wanted to teach us? And we don't have to guess, because we know what God would do if he wanted to teach us, because Jesus is God and we can see how he taught us. And what did he do to teach us? He taught with stories, right? He taught with stories. Now, he taught with stories that are called parables, and that's different from fables. Fables and parables are two different kinds of methods, or two different methods that you can use to teach. The difference is that fables use stories that are impossible, but parables use stories that are possible. So even though they may not be true, even though the stories that Jesus tells might never have actually happened, they're still possible stories. For example, it's a story about a woman who was looking for a lost coin and she swept her house and she finally found. Well, that's a realistic story. It doesn't mean that that ever happened. He's not telling a story about a woman that he knows. He's using the story and using the characters to teach a lesson. He says a farmer went out into his field to sow seed, and he did this and that, and some seed fell over here, and some seed was eaten by the birds. And well, that's a parable. That's a realistic story. It's not a true story, but it's a realistic story. That's what parables are. Fables are a little different. Fables are, we wouldn't say ridiculous stories. Obviously, it's ridiculous that animals are talking to each other and, traveling around and doing business and stuff like that. But they're entertaining stories that are not realistic. But they're easy to remember because partly because they're silly and funny to read. All right, so that's why we study fables. They teach us, though, very important moral lessons. So even though the stories can be silly sometimes and enjoyable, they're not jokes. It's not silly stuff. These are very important lessons. I'm 48 years old, and even in my professional life, when I'm writing, I use fables that I've read in Aesop's Fables to make points or to give illustrations for things that I want to write about. You can use these fables throughout your whole life in the most serious situations. So they're enjoyable stories. Sometimes they're funny stories, but they're not silly. They teach very important moral lessons, and they're very helpful in your writing. So as you get older and you have to write essays and papers and do all kinds of writing work, or do public speaking where you've got to talk to a group or teach people, as you learn these fables, you have a collection of illustrations that you can use to explain things and illustrate things and teach things for your whole life. So there are many, many benefits of knowing Aesop's fables. What I often do is when I want to teach something or there's an idea that I want to share, one of the first things I do is I ask myself, can I think of any Bible passages that teach the same idea that I could use in my writing? Then I think, are there any Aesop's fables that I could use in my writing? So it's one of the sources that I always use. Anytime I'm teaching or speaking or writing, I ask myself, are there any fables that I can think of? Or sometimes I even ask my own children. I say, hey, kids, can you think of any fables in Aesop's Fables that teach a story about a person who does this or that? And sometimes the kids can actually help me think of some good examples. So you can use these fables throughout your entire life. They'll help you to write in an interesting way, in a way that other students who don't study Aesop's Fables can't write. So it gives you an advantage in your writing. That's why they're so important. So what we're going to do in these lessons, in these classes we have, is we're just going to go through a fable together, and I'm going to help you think a little more deeply through the fable, because the fables were written by a man named Aesop, who was a very wise man. So they're not silly stories. It's not a story that grandpa made up to entertain his kids. It's not just some fun story. It's not a nursery rhyme or a Dr. Seuss story that's just meant to entertain and give kids something to do. These stories were written by a very wise man in the ancient world, and they teach very important lessons. And when you're a young child, you can read these stories and you can learn some simple lessons. But when you get older and you get more mature and you get more experience in life, as you continue to read these fables and think about them more, you find out that there are deeper and deeper lessons, and you can study these fables for your whole life and still get new ideas from them. So they're very deep lessons, and again, they were written by a very wise man. We have to pay attention to all of the details because every little detail is important. And we need to take time to chew on them, think about them, talk about them, and understand exactly what they teach us. For a time when you're young and just getting started, it's hard to read them and understand the moral lessons. It's sort of a skill you have to get used to and learn what to look for. It's like riding a bike. It's hard when you've never done it before, but then as soon as you do it the first few times, and you just learn what it feels like, it's never a problem again. So it takes some time for you to get used to the fables, and that's what I'd like to help with. I'd like to just walk you through them, show you how you should read them, show you how you should think about them, and then help you to complete the assignments. So this can be an easy course for you that you enjoy. All right, so the fable we're going to study today, I'm going to share my screen here. We're going to study the fable of the birds, the beasts, and the bat. So give me a wave if you can see that fable up on the screen. Is it nice and clear? Good. All right, good. Thank you. So we're going to study the birds, the beasts, and the bat. Now, today I'm going to read the fable and talk about it. So just hang out and bear with me. But in the future, when our class group settles down and it's the same kids each week, I'll allow one of you to volunteer and read the fable for us. But I'll do it today since it's our first class. So this is the fable of the birds, the beasts, and the bat. And if you've got a piece of paper in front of you, you don't have to do this because this is going to be recorded. But if you've got a piece of paper and a pen, just jot down the title of the fable, the birds, the beasts, and the bat. And you can scribble when you're taking notes because you can always clean them up later on. So the fable of the birds, the beasts, and the bat. And here's the fable. So listen carefully. Once upon a time, a fierce war was waged between the birds and the beasts. So keep that in mind. There's a war between the birds and the beasts. So the beasts would be all the land animals. Lions, tigers, cows, dogs, cats, they're all beasts. A fierce war between the birds and the beasts. The bat, so we have to think about the bat, what a bat is. A bat can fly, but a bat doesn't have feathers. And if you read Aristotle's History of Animals, which is one of our courses, you'll learn that scientists have a hard time figuring out what a bat is. Is a bat a kind of a bird? It doesn't have any feathers. It's not really like a bird, but it's also not like an animal. It's like a flying beast. So it's sort of in between birds and beasts. So the bat is a really weird animal. At first, the bat fought on the side of the birds. So the bat really didn't know what side he should fight on. So at first, he fought on the side of the birds, since he flies like them. But later on in the day, the tide of the battle ran so much in favor of the beasts. So as the day went on, it looked like the beasts were starting to win the battle. So he changed over and fought on the other side. So there we have the main image of the story that we need to think about. There's a battle, a war between the birds and the beasts, and the poor bat is stuck in the middle, and he doesn't really know what side he should fight on. So at first he fights with the birds, but then as he sees how things are going, he says, I don't know about this. It looks like the beasts are going to win. Maybe I should join the other side. However, owing to the admirable conduct and courage of the eagle, so the eagle is the greatest of the birds, and he's said to be admirable and courageous here, the tide of the battle once more and finally turned in favor of the birds. So the eagle led the birds to victory. The bat, to save his life and escape the shame of falling into the hands of his deserted friends, fled, and has ever since skulked in caves and hollow trees, coming out only in the dusk when the birds have gone to roost. So this is the fable of the birds, the beasts, and the bat. Now, the first thing you need to do when you study a fable is you need to take time to read it and reread it. Make sure you understand all the details, because if you don't understand all the details, you can't figure out the moral lesson of the fable. You have to understand all the details. So if there are any words in the fable that you don't know the meaning of the word, you need to take some time, use a dictionary, look the words up, figure out what the words mean. And when you have all the information straight and gathered together, read it through again and make sure you understand all the details. So there are a few difficult words in this fable. You might not know, for example, what the phrase tide of battle. You might read tide of battle and say, I don't know what that phrase means. So you might have to ask for some help with something like that. And then there's a word further down by near the end, skulked. You might not know what the word skulked means. That's not a word we use every day. So you can see that you need to take some time just to make sure you understand all the language and understand every sentence in the fable, and then read it one or more times after you've got everything figured out to make sure you understand all the details of the fable. Then what you need to do for your assignment is you need to paraphrase the fable. It asks you to paraphrase the fable. And what a paraphrase means is to retell the story in your own words, but tell it in a way that proves you understand all the details. So it doesn't mean to just give one sentence and say, oh, the fable's about some birds and beasts fighting, period. That's not a paraphrase. A paraphrase is a repetition of the fable that proves that you understand the story and understand all the details of the story. So it should be shorter than the fable, but it should prove that you read the fable carefully and understand all the details. That's what a paraphrase is. All right. So if I was to paraphrase this fable, I would say something like this. And this is just off the top of my head, so bear with me. I would say, in this fable, we read about a war between birds and beasts. In this war, the bat, who is neither a bird nor a beast, has a hard time figuring out what side to fight on. At first, he fights with the birds, but then he chooses to fight with the beasts. And when he learns that the birds are going to win, he's ashamed that he betrayed the birds. And so he goes away and hides. And that's why even today, the bats hide when the birds are out and don't show themselves until evening comes. So that's a paraphrase, all right? What I said includes all the details of the fable in my own words, and it proves that I understand the fable, okay? That's a paraphrase. So that's the first thing you need to do. Usually students don't have much trouble paraphrasing the fables unless they try to get the assignment done without really studying carefully, and I can tell because they leave out important details. And usually that's just the beginning of their problems, because if you don't understand all the details of the fable, you're not going to be able to figure out the moral lesson of the story. So step one is write a good paraphrase of the fable. Then you're asked to explain the moral lesson of the fable. And this is where students have a difficult time. Students have a difficult time explaining the moral lesson of the fable because they usually, especially when you're young, you don't know what to look for. You don't really know what the message is. So it's difficult when you're young. When you're older, sometimes you learn these moral lessons in other stories or proverbs and Bible readings and things like that. So you kind of know what to look for. But when you're younger, sometimes you don't know what to look for, and it's difficult to figure out the moral lesson of the fable. So in this moral lesson, you've got to pay attention to all the details. And let me ask you, you can text this in the chat. What do you think the moral lesson of this fable is? I'm going to explain it, but let's just give a chance here for anyone who wants to take a shot at it. Anyone who'd like to take a shot at explaining the moral lesson of this fable, what do you think the moral lesson is? I'll wait a minute or two, and you can just type a short answer. You don't have to type in complete sentences here or anything like that. What do you think the moral lesson is of this fable? And I'm not going to pick on anyone's answers, so don't worry. George Owen says, I think it is to stay on one side. Cecilia says, if you aren't loyal to your friends, you won't have any. Mary says to be loyal. Luke says not to change sides in war. All right, good. So we've got a handful or so, and they're all pretty good. So good. We've got some ideas about the moral lesson of the fable. Now, one thing that's important is you've got to remember that the man who wrote this fable, Aesop, was a wise man. And when wise men speak or write, they never say anything that's not necessary, and they never leave anything out because they're wise. They say exactly what needs to be said. They don't leave anything out, so there's no other details that you need to add to the story. And when they include details, they mean to include those details because those details are significant. So that's why it's important when you read the fable, pay attention to all the details, because the moral of the lesson usually depends on the details of the story. Usually, if a student gets one of these questions wrong, it's because they're trying to give the moral of the story and they don't have all the details, because the details actually prove that their answer is wrong. And I'll give you an example. If you've been studying this course already, you know the fable of the cock and the jewel, right? Where the rooster finds a jewel in the chicken yard, and he throws it away. And I'll ask, what is the moral of this fable? And some students, when they write the moral of the fable, they'll say something like, luxurious things aren't important in life. All that matters is what's necessary. And the moral lesson that they teach suggests to us that the cock is actually wise and good. But if we read the details of the story, Aesop tells us that the cock is not wise. It tells us that he's foolish and immature. So the details of the fable, if you would read the details carefully, you would know that the story is not that the cock made a good choice and we should be like the rooster. And if we find the jewel, we should throw it away and keep looking for grain. That's not what the fable teaches. And the reason why the student makes that mistake is because they didn't read the details of the fable. Okay, so when we look at this fable, we've got to pay attention to the details. We've got to know something about the characters first. Why would Aesop choose birds, beasts, and a bat? As I said, the bat is a weird animal. It doesn't fit in either group. It's like the birds because it flies, but it's also not like the birds. It doesn't have feathers. I don't know if bats lay eggs. Bats might give birth to live baby bats like mice do. So I'm not sure, that might be another difference. But bats are not birds. So when we look at them and say, oh, well, they fly, they should join the bird. Well, that's not really true. So the bat, we can understand why the bat might not know which side to join. He's like the bird, but also not like the bird. So he's confused, and he makes a pick in the beginning, and he chooses to side with the birds. And then as the battle goes on, it starts to look like the birds are going to lose. And he says, well, I have an excuse. I don't have to be with the birds. I could be with the beasts if I want to, because I'm really not a bird. So he changes sides, and then in the end, it turns out that the birds actually win. So he's stuck because he chose to betray the birds and leave their side and go to the side of their enemy, and they won. So now he's stuck. So the battle's over. I guess the beasts get beat up, or the birds punish them in some way. Again, it's a fable, so don't get all serious about it. But the bat now is stuck in an uncomfortable situation because he chose to side with the beasts. They lost. The birds won. Now what does he do? He's embarrassed and ashamed that he didn't stick with the birds. So Aesop tells us that he went and hid in the caves and in hollow trees, and he never comes out when the birds are out. He waits until they go to their nests for the night, comes out in the evening. And that's true. If you have bats where you live, you know that when the sun's going down, the birds all disappear. And just as the sun's going down and it's starting to get dark, you'll see bats flying around. I know where we live, we see bats in the evening. So that's true about the bats there. But what Aesop's doing here is explaining, he's using the behavior of bats to explain why they do that. And he does it with a moral story that he's making up. It's true that bats come out in the evening, I don't think it's true that they come out in the evening because they're ashamed of betraying the birds when the birds fought the beasts, right? That's a story he's telling. That's a certain kind of story. I'll give you the fancy name for it. I'll type it in the chat real quick. Give me 1 second. Let me type this. I just typed a word in the chat. It's called etiology. Etiology. An etiology is a story that attempts to explain whether it's realistic or not. It attempts to explain where something came from. Like why do certain things do what they do? Why, for example, do bees sting? You can think of a story. You can try to be a scientist and tell a true natural history of the bee, or you can just make up a story of how the bee began stinging people. Those stories about the origins of where things came from, sometimes they're just meant to be fun. Sometimes they're used to teach moral lessons. Those are called etiologies. And you'll see them all through ancient literature and mythology and stuff like that. Etiology. So this is an example of an etiology. Aesop is telling us why the bats come out at night. Bats come out at night because they're ashamed of the day when they betrayed the birds in battle. So they're always ashamed to show themselves when the birds are out. So they hide in caves and trees. Okay. Now, the moral lesson of the story, which I think you guys did pretty well, those of you who offered some suggestions. The moral of the story is that when we join a team, right? When you join a team, you have to think about the purpose of being on the team. The purpose of being on a team is to help the team win. That's the purpose of being on a team. So if you're involved in any kind of contest, it could be a business contest, it could be a sports game, anything. Also, it could be a military contest. When you're a member of a team, your job is to help your team win. Your job is not to sit around and try to guess which side is going to win so you can avoid losing. Your job is to help the best team win. Hopefully the team that has the just cause, right? Whoever has the right in the argument, you should join them and work to help them win, not sit back and try to see who's going to win and join the winner at the end. That's not a virtuous spirit. That's why we read here in the story that the eagle was virtuous. The eagle is like the opposite of the bat. The eagle was on the bird side. The eagle saw that the birds were losing. But what did the eagle do? He was admirable and courageous, and he fought harder to help the birds win. So the eagle is the example of what we should be like. We should fight for our side and work to help our side win, even when it looks like we might lose. So the eagle is considered to be the good example, and the bat is the bad example. The bat sat around trying to guess which side would win and ended up not helping anyone. So it's right that the bat should be ashamed for his behavior because he wasn't admirable or courageous or virtuous like the eagle. The eagle teaches us how we should think about participating in a contest. We should choose the right side, choose the true side or the good side, and then we should fight like the eagle courageously to try to help that side win. And if that fight requires us to sacrifice everything, it may be better for us to sacrifice everything than to live with shame like the bat did. So that's the moral of the fable, right? It's to fight for the right side, to risk your own life for the sake of the right side, rather than try to save yourself like the bat. Okay, that's the moral lesson. So again, if you've got a piece of paper and a pen, you might want to jot that down because you can go to the study center even today and just complete this assignment because we've already talked about it. So the moral lesson of the fable is to fight for the right side to the end and not think of saving yourself. Fight for the right side to the end, to imitate the eagle rather than the bat. And so you can see, for this moral lesson, you can see how easy it is to remember. You should remember that you should be like the eagle, not like the bat. The eagle is praised forever for its virtue. The bat is ashamed forever because of its lack of virtue. Be like the eagle, not like the bat. Okay, so that's the moral lesson of the fable. The next question that you're asked in the assignments is, why did Aesop choose these characters? Why did he choose these characters? And sometimes that's a difficult question. Sometimes you need to ask that question before you figure out the moral lesson. But the reason why Aesop chose the birds, the beast, and the bat is because it provides the perfect characters for a story of a battle where there's one person who is, who's a what's called a fair weather fan, and I'll explain that term in a minute. But the birds and the beasts being two different kinds of animals, and the bat being an animal that's sort of in between the two, not really a bird, not really a beast, provides the perfect characters to tell this story. So that's why Aesop chooses those characters. So that's how you would answer that question. And then the last question that sometimes is hard for students is, how can you apply this fable, this moral lesson to your life? How can you apply this moral lesson to your life? Now, when you're 10 years old, you're not out fighting in any battle. So obviously you can't say, when I go out to the battlefield tomorrow, I'm going to make sure I'm faithful to my side. Obviously, that's not the moral lesson. So it needs to be general, and it should be something that applies to your life. Now, one helpful way to think about this, if you study the Bible and learn the catechism and learn about the saints, you can think of how this fable, how the moral lesson of this fable relates to some lesson you've learned about Christian life. So for example, Jesus says to his disciples, if anyone is ashamed of me, I will be ashamed of him. Jesus says to his disciples, you need to take up your cross and follow me. And so what do we see? We see that in Christian teaching, we're told that we need to join the side of the Christians, and we need to be willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of the Christian faith. So it's like the battle between the birds and the beasts. And Jesus tells us that we can't act like the bat in Aesop's fable. We can't be like a bat that sits in the middle, and on one day it looks like the enemies of Christianity are winning, so we sort of go join them, and then another day it looks like Christianity is doing well, so we go back and help them. That's the character of the bat, and we're not allowed to live like the bat. We're to be like the eagle. We're to choose the right side and fight for that side until we die if we need to. And that's what it means to take up the cross, right? To be willing to suffer the loss of everything for the sake of what's right. To be willing to die for your friends, right? Jesus says, no greater love has a man than this, that he's willing to lay his life down for his friends. And that's the idea that we learn in the Christian faith. We become Christians not because mom and dad are Christians, not because Christians have good music or have pretty churches. We become Christians for the sake of the teachings and beliefs of the Christian faith, that they're true and right. And we need to be willing to stick to those teachings and practice those teachings, no matter what it costs us. That's what it means to be virtuous, like the eagle, and not to live like the bat. And you'll see many people who are like the bat. They maybe go to church on Sunday, but when they're around other kids, when they're around some kids who are bullies, or they like to make fun of religion, they're immoral kids, well, then those kids will start to act like those kids, and they don't talk about Christianity. Those kids are like the bat, right? They don't pick a side. They just sort of go with whoever they think is going to win. That's not a virtuous life, right? We need to be like the eagle. So if you're going to think about how this moral lesson applies to your life, you don't have to think about fighting in a battle. You can just think and say, when I know that something is right, I need to stick to it and work for what's right, even when it seems like what's wrong is going to win. I need to be like the eagle and fight for my friends. I need to be faithful to the right side and not try to join the side that appears like it's going to win. So I need to be a faithful member of the right side of any contest, any battle. I used the phrase before, fair weather fan, or fair weather friend. A fair weather fan is like a fan of a sports team who, when the team is winning, that fan, wears his team's uh, jersey and maybe goes to the game and puts posters on his wall of his team. And then when the team starts to lose, he takes the jersey off, complains about the team, takes the posters off his wall. Then if the team starts to win again, he goes back as a fan and starts talking about the team. That's a fair weather fan. That's not a real fan. That's not a real friend, right? So the moral lesson here is to not be a fair weather fan, to not be like the bat that tries to pick which side will win to save himself, but to be like the eagle and choose the right side and be willing to stay faithful to that side until the end, because it may be that you are the source of the victory, as the eagle was. And now, through Aesop's fable, the eagle is celebrated and praised forever for his courage and virtue. Okay, so how this fable can apply to our life: it teaches us to always stay faithful to the right side, even when things are difficult, always to stay faithful and never to try to save ourselves by going to another side that's bad. So that's how it applies to our life. And then lastly, the very last question, you're usually asked to just briefly summarize the lesson. And that's usually pretty easy for students. So just quickly summarize the lesson, and that's it for the assignments for Aesop's Fables. So that's, for those of you who are new, that's how we study Aesop's Fables. It's easy for me because I'm almost 50 years old and I've been studying philosophy for 25 years. So I may make it look really easy, but it's just because I have experience doing this. It'll take you a little while to get used to this kind of study, but that's the purpose of this course. The purpose of this course is to help you begin learning to read stories like this, think of moral lessons, think of how they apply to your life, and then use them in your life. Use these fables. When you tell stories, when you teach people, if you try to solve problems, talk to your friends, talk to your parents, you can use the fables to help you communicate in a persuasive way. And that's why it's good to study them. So it takes some time to get comfortable with them, but once you learn what it feels like to read them and think about the moral lesson and identify the moral, and then think of how it applies to your life, it'll get easier and easier, and you'll just start blowing through these lessons pretty quickly. So that's the fable of the birds, the beasts, and the bat. We paraphrased it together. We talked about the moral lesson together. We talked about why Aesop chose these characters. We looked at some vocabulary that might be unfamiliar, talked about that, cleared that up, and then we wrapped up what would have been that assignment for that lesson. So we'll do this each week for one fable. So every week you join me for a fable, we'll go through the whole thing, and you should be able to turn right around, get on the study center, find the lesson we talked about, and submit that assignment and be done with it. So it should help you get your assignments done and move through the course. But you can also go back wherever you are in the course and also do those fables as well. So some students, when we go through these fables together, they'll get 2 or 3 fable lessons done each week. They'll submit the one that I help them with, but then they'll also go back to where they're at in the course and submit those fables as well. So hopefully it helps you to get through that course more quickly. And then later on, when we get into higher level courses like ethics, for example, if you study moral philosophy when you're a high school student, if you read Aristotle's Ethics, which we read in high school, it's very difficult to understand. But if you've already studied Aesop's Fables, you have a lot of the moral ideas already in your head from your Fables studies that will help you to understand more difficult lessons in harder courses later on. So not only is Aesop's Fables a good course for introducing you to these moral lessons, it's also good preparation for future philosophy studies because it gives you a comfortable introduction to ideas that you're going to need to understand for future studies, okay? So that's all for the Fable of the Birds, the Beasts, and the Bat. It's 1:45, so I took a little longer than I planned to, but we got through everything, so that's good. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and just get back to regular. So over in the chat box, if there's anything you'd like to ask about, any questions you have, go ahead and fire away, and we'll use the rest of our time just to answer questions or talk about anything you'd like to talk about. If any of you would like to get back to work and get out of this meeting, you can do so, because we're just going to discuss questions students ask from now on. This whole meeting will be available on the Academy YouTube channel and on the Vimeo channel. So if you'd like to watch it later, if you didn't take notes and want to use it to help you complete the assignment, you can watch it later. But that's all for my information for this class. The rest of the time, we'll just chat and then wrap up once the chat calms down. So thanks for coming. I hope that was helpful. And if you've got no questions and don't have anything you'd like to talk about, you're free to go now. And those of you who would like to chat, fire away in the chat box, and I'll answer any questions or talk about any topics you bring up, all right? So thanks for everyone who came and is leaving, and the rest of you, let's dig into the chat. You're all welcome. Thank you for coming. Any questions about this fable, first of all? Any questions about this fable? And if not, if there are any questions about another fable, maybe a fable you're currently working on that you're having a hard time with, or if you submitted an assignment and didn't get a passing grade and you want to figure out why you didn't get a passing grade, we can talk about the fables. Otherwise, you're free to leave. You're welcome. Thank you for coming, Dominic. So I'm assuming your name is pronounced Adel. I hope that's the right pronunciation. You ask, what if the right side ends up failing? Well, if the right side ends up failing, sometimes our job is to make sure it failed because we used everything we could use to try and help it win. So sometimes it's necessary to sacrifice everything in the attempt to win. Maybe we can't control the outcome, but we should do everything we can. I mean, just think, if you think about wars that have been fought, how many soldiers died? Many soldiers fought on the side that lost in the end. But it was their duty to do so. It was their duty to try and fight to the end, to cause their side to win if they could. And it just turned out that they lost. But sometimes you can lose a battle, you can lose an individual battle, but still win the war. In history, I'll type a word here in the chat. A Pyrrhic victory. If you study Greek history, Roman history, there's something called a Pyrrhic victory, which is when one side wins a battle, but that side has to spend so much to win that battle that it ends up causing them to lose the war. So even though we lose an individual battle, and it may look like a soldier gave his life in vain, or someone lost something in vain, sometimes our willingness to fight and sacrifice and make the opponent work harder causes the opponent to lose the war down the road, because we made him pay so much for that one victory. So even when we lose a battle, sometimes a losing battle can cause our side to win the war. So it's more complicated than that. And we need to sort of trust that sometimes it's not for us to try to figure out who's going to win, but just do everything that we can to help our side. Okay? There are other times, though, just to be fair, there are other times if we have absolutely no chance of winning. So for example, if I decide to declare war on Russia myself, and I get a couple guns and get onto a boat and sail across the ocean and decide that I'm going to go to war against Russia by myself, that's not a just cause, because it's impossible. Okay, so if we find that there's a problem and the outcome really is impossible, it's not just to, to fight for that kind of victory. That's just suicide, right? That's not a responsible fight. So there are times when the fight is not just because it's an impossible fight, a fight that we can't possibly win, where it's better to compromise and try to make an agreement rather than fight for the death of an impossible cause. So it takes wisdom to know the difference of those things. But we're talking about a situation where it's clear that the bat should have fought for one side, and he chose not to. So Henry asks or objects to what I said, says this: the fable does not say because it's about the bat being wrong, but by switching sides. Um, the reason why I would disagree with that, Henry, and say that the bat was wrong is because the eagle is praised as admirable and courageous for sticking with the birds. If the bat didn't do anything wrong, then he would have nothing to be ashamed of. So he could have chosen any sides in the beginning. He would have been left to choose sides, and there would have been nothing really wrong with him doing so. But Aesop clearly teaches us that by changing sides, he should have sided with the birds. And when he chose to change his side, it was shameful, and he should have been like the eagle. So I think Aesop is saying a little bit more than just that, he could have picked any side he wanted to. All right. No, that's good. That's just called an objection, Henry. That's fine, right? If I say something and there's something that I say that you think isn't good, that's what it means to raise an objection. That's good. Do that. All right. So let's see what else we've got going on down here. Where do the bats belong? You mean what side they belong on? That's what I was talking about. The bats really don't fit into either of those sides. Because they're like birds, but they're also not like birds. That's why Aesop chose the bat to tell this story, because the bat's kind of a weird animal. Okay, let's see what else we've got on here. Stephen asks, should we apply similar studying techniques to Aesop's fables that we do to scripture in Latin? That is, read it once, reread it in detail, consider writing it out, consider trying to memorize the details. Yes, that's, what I wrote an article for students called How to Study for Mastery, and those are just general rules. That's just how we study, right? So the first time you read something, when you've got something to read like a fable or anything, you should just read it over one time pretty quickly, just to know what's in the reading. And then after you get a good idea of what it's about, you can get yourself ready to dig in and really study it. Sometimes it doesn't make much sense to try to study it carefully from the beginning because you don't even know what it's about. So it's better to go through it once, get an idea of what it's about, then go through it in detail. And then you'll start to identify what you think are important points, and you can take notes and write an outline. Ask yourself, what's the author really trying to say here? What's the main idea? Start to piece that stuff together. It's just a process. It's really true for any kind of study. So I'd say yes to that. You also wrote, I did not catch many of the details that made the story come alive after reading it just once. That's the whole point, right? That first reading is just a survey, and then we get into the study of it afterwards. And again, when I read these fables, remember, I've been doing this stuff for a long time. So I'm very familiar with Aesop. I know the way he does things. I know what to look for and so on. So I may make it look easy just because I have experience doing this. And as you do this repeatedly, it'll get easier. And that's true for any study, any author. So if students do struggle with it and can't do it as easily as I just did it, well, that's understandable, right? I've been doing this for a long time. So don't think that there's something wrong with you because you can't read it and see the moral lesson as easily as I appear to do. You shouldn't. That's why we're having this class, so I can help you learn to do that. And then lastly, you asked, should I use a template to studying that's similar to scripture or language studies? Yes, it's that article, How to Study for Mastery. That applies to all studies, okay? So let's see, scroll down here. All right, any other questions? Any other comments. And remember, you don't have to agree with me if you think I say something wrong. I like to go back and forth, and I'm comfortable defending myself. So if you ever think I say something that's not exactly right, feel free to raise an objection. And just so you know, when you object to something someone says, let me give a quick lesson on this. The question is not what is my opinion and what is your opinion. We're not going to argue about our opinions. To be honest, you don't have to worry about my opinion if it's just my opinion, and I don't have to worry about your opinion if it's just your opinion. What we're worried about is what the author actually writes, what the reading actually says. That's what matters. So we should be arguing about what we actually read in the fable, not what you think or what he thinks or what I think. Nobody cares what any of us think. What matters is what's actually in there. And if I say something like, who was it, George or Henry before? I said the bat should have stayed with the birds and fought on the right side. And he said, wait a minute, the fable doesn't say anything about the birds being the right side. That was a good argument, right? That's a good objection. And so when we look at it, we have to ask the question, why would you say the birds were the right side if, Aesop doesn't seem to say that? And I gave my reason for why I would say that, because the eagle is called admirable and courageous, and the bat is said to be shameful. So Aesop seems to suggest that the right side for the bat would have been with the birds. Okay, so that's a good objection, right? You're free to do that, because all of us are accountable to what we read in the story, just like in the Bible or in the catechism or in any other subject. We're accountable to what we read. Nobody has the right to say, oh, this means this and that. No, we have to prove what we say from what we read. So always, if you think that you see something in the reading that's saying something other than what I say, or if you hear me say something and you don't think that that's in the reading, it's your job to point that out. And I actually would like for you to do that, because it gives us good discussion. All right, so George writes on here, let me see. I see one name on here. I'm not sure about the pronunciation. It looks like Johanni. I might pronounce that wrong. I'm sorry. Did Aesop write the fables over the years, or was it all at the same time? Yeah, what likely happened, you can imagine this would take a lot of time to think of these stories, right? What likely happened is through the years, throughout his life, he probably had experiences or thought of these different stories as they occurred, and he collected these stories throughout his life. What we know about Aesop in history is that he was a lawyer, so he was involved in court cases and things like that, and he had to try to persuade judges and juries and get them to vote for his side of the case. And the tradition says that he used to use these fables as parts of his arguments in these court cases to try to persuade his audiences through the fables. So they're probably things that he collected through the years and developed in his different cases and things like that. And they were also written by other people too. And we call them Aesop's fables because they're like Aesop's fables. So they were likely collected over time. You wouldn't just sit down and start writing out all these fables with all this wisdom in a couple of days. So he likely collected them. All right, that's a good question. George says it wasn't the bat losing the war that shamed it. It was switching to the wrong side. Well, George, you just said that the beasts were the wrong side, so that defeats your argument, right? If the beasts were the wrong side, then that's what was wrong about switching to that side. If the beasts were the right side and he chose to switch, that would have been a good decision, right? If the beasts were the right side and he started on the wrong side and then switched to the right side, Aesop would have said he finally, on that day, he finally made the right decision and joined the right side. But even you said he switched to the wrong side. So you contradicted yourself. That's what you've got to watch out for. Okay. Zoriana asks, what does Pyrrhic mean? Well, Pyrrhic is a word that's from the name of a person. There was a Greek military person named Pyrrhus. And you can find this story. I'm not sure where you can read it, but you can find the story of Pyrrhus. During the Roman Republic, when the Romans were becoming powerful, The Romans could defeat all their enemies. The Romans would often be attacked by other people and they would always be victorious. But there was one person that the Romans couldn't defeat, and it was a Greek leader named Pyrrhus. Pyrrhus was such a great leader that he could actually defeat the Roman armies. The problem with Pyrrhus's victories is that Pyrrhus had to spend and lose so much that even though he won many battles, he lost the war. So Pyrrhus is an example of a person who wins, but he wins at a price that's too great. And so the Romans, because they had more resources, they had more people, more money, and so on, all they had to do was wait for Pyrrhus to finally run out of resources, and they were able to win. But in an even fight, Pyrrhus could defeat the Romans. But the problem was it wasn't an even fight. The Romans had more resources. So there are fights or battles or contests that we can win sometimes, but the cost is too great. For example, let's say one of you said, when I grow up, I want to be a lawyer, and you decided that you were going to sacrifice everything to become a lawyer, and you sacrificed so much, and you finally became a lawyer and achieved your goal and were successful, but you had sacrificed so much that you lost your family members, you lost all your friends, and so your victory came at a great cost, right? That would be called a Pyrrhic victory. It wasn't worth the cost of the victory, and in the end, you're going to be left wondering why you wanted to do that in the first place, and you're going to realize that you wanted to do it so you could share the benefits with your friends and your family, and you lost them all. So it was a Pyrrhic victory. All right? So that's an example of how that applies to life. Next, let's see what else is coming in here. So that's what Pyrrhic means. It's named after the Greek leader Pyrrhus, who was actually able to beat up the Romans, but just didn't have enough men and money. Is it possible that Aesop was alluding to a higher self versus lower self when using animals of the sky that fly versus beasts of the earth that are worldly? That's a great question. And this is what I was saying. I don't know if you heard me at the beginning of the class. I said, Aesop was a wise man. He wrote these fables, which are simple enough for young children to read and understand. But if we keep meditating on them as we mature and grow up, we'll find that they just keep offering more and more lessons for us. So yeah, we can get into these more abstract or philosophical ideas and say, you know what, I can see in this fable a lesson about this. Well, an 8-year-old child isn't going to see that lesson, but a 48-year-old man like me can see that and say, I can see this as an example of such, and we can use the fables in any different situation we want to. That's why the fables are so helpful. That's also why it's helpful that they're ridiculous stories, because they're not really tied to a certain event or certain people. They're ridiculous. They're stories about animals having wars. We can draw out of these stories the simple moral lesson and use it to illustrate any idea that it relates to. So yeah, we can make those applications. That's the whole point, right? It applies to any situation. It's a good question. Yeah, he was a lawyer. You can learn about Aesop's life. Even in this book, I'm not sure if I'm right about this. Let me check. His life might even be at the beginning of this book. Let me check real quick. Sometimes at the beginning of books, they have a little brief life of the author. Let's see. Check real quick. Maybe not. No, not this one. But you can find a life of Aesop. Or I'll find one. Maybe I'll post an article on the website. I'll share a life of Aesop if you're interested in that. All right, any other questions? Any other questions? Anything else? Did I miss anybody's comment? Just repost it if I missed it, if you asked something and I missed it. I didn't miss it on purpose. Which book am I using? In the study center, there are links to the lessons, and that book that's linked to those lessons is the book we're using. You can get all the information you need out of the front of that book. Just open it up and scroll to the beginning of the book, okay? The Lion in Love. The Lion in Love. Well, give me a minute. I'll look that one up real fast. See if I can look it up. Yeah, okay. I found it here. The Lion in Love. Let's take a look. The Lion in Love. Let me read it real fast, Daniel. Did Aesop live in the medieval world? No, Aesop was a Greek. He lived a long time ago. A lion fell in love with the beautiful daughter of a forester and demanded her of her father in marriage. The man dared not refuse because he was a lion, though he would gladly have done so. But he told the lion that his daughter was so young and delicate that he would need to, pull all his teeth and claws out. So the lion, because he was so enslaved by love that he agreed to give up his teeth and claws for this girl. And then once the lion had his teeth and claws removed, the forester took a club and whacked him on the head and killed him. Yeah, so the moral of that fable, Daniel, would be for the lion. You see, that now I don't want to just tell you the moral because that's lazy. There are clues in the fable that show us the moral. That's what you need to learn to look for. There are clues in the detail. So let me share my screen real quick and I'll show you. Just a second. So the Lion in Love, there's a clue here. Look what it says in this sentence right here. The lion was so enslaved by love. You see that? He was enslaved by love. Does that sound like a good thing or a bad thing? That's a bad thing, right? So he was so crazy about this girl that he was willing to agree to anything. And so he agreed to give up his teeth and his claws, which made him actually weaker than the father who didn't want him to marry his daughter. And when he gave up his teeth and his claws, which were actually the reason why he was going to be able to marry that girl, right? Because the father wouldn't say no, because the lion was too powerful. Notice it says the man durst not refuse. So because the lion had teeth and claws, that man would never say no to the lion. But because the man, right, human beings are smarter than animals, the man decides to use his cunning to trick the lion and say, well, my daughter, she's so delicate. I'm afraid you might hurt her with your teeth and claws. So maybe if you got rid of your teeth and claws, maybe then I would say, okay. So the lion, being enslaved to love, which is a bad thing, like being crazy, decides to give up his teeth and claws, makes himself weaker than the girl's father. And then the girl's father says, okay, great. And bonks him on the head, right? And says, no, you may not marry my daughter. And now there's nothing you can do about it, right? So the moral of this lesson, the moral of the lesson is to not allow our emotions or passions to overwhelm us so that we're no longer using our reason, right? The lion should have been reasonable, but he was enslaved. He was turned into a slave because of his love, which was irrational. And it teaches us that we need to be rational and always make sure that our passions or desires or emotions are kept under the control of reason, right? You got that? Make sense? All right, good. But like I said, the moral lessons, you can see that there are clues in the fable. You've got to read carefully. There are clues that reveal to us the moral that Aesop intends for us to learn. You've got to read carefully and watch for those clues. All right. Very good, George. It's another Pyrrhic story. That's right. Yeah, the lion thinks he's going to win this battle, but it costs him too much, right? And he ends up losing in the end. That's very good. It's another example of a Pyrrhic victory. Good. Anything else? Any other Any other questions, especially about today's fable or just about studying fables in general? Now, let me just say this. I don't know, there's 13 of you left. If you find these meetings helpful, I'm willing to have more of these meetings for other courses. If there's courses that you'd like to study together, just let me know, all right? For me, it's just a matter of students wanting to get together and meet. If students want to meet, I'm willing to meet. I just need to know what courses you're interested in and need help with, and we need to find some meeting time. So just let me know, all right? A Pliny course, I probably wouldn't do a Pliny course because I consider Pliny to be like an enrichment course. It's not necessary for classical studies. Interesting for sure, right? Definitely interesting, but I'd like to try to help you with courses that really are core courses for your studies to help you with the harder stuff. Greek grammar. Yes, at the beginning of the year or a couple weeks ago, I said I was going to do a Greek meeting and then changed my mind because not many students were registered for it. But if that's something you want, I'll make you a deal. I'll make the Greek meeting available again, and we'll see how registration looks. If we get like 20 kids signed up for Greek classes, we'll have a Greek class. If it's just a couple kids, I won't do it. Why didn't the birds fly away? That's a good question. Well, birds don't live in the air, right? They have to come down eventually. So the birds can't just stay flying all the time. They've got to have a place to be safe on Earth. So they would have to fight for safety on the ground. Can we have a live class for Latin reading or vocabulary? We do tomorrow. On Wednesdays, we'll have Latin studies. And in Latin studies, we'll talk about Latin reading, Latin vocabulary. I'm making videos for Latin grammar, so I'm hoping that in the future, you won't need much help with Latin grammar because I'm already making videos. So we'll talk about Latin reading and vocabulary in our Wednesday classes. Anything else? We'll wrap up at 2:15 here today. Good questions, lots of good stuff. What about classical grammar? Classical grammar is an English grammar course. I think classical grammar, it's difficult, it's challenging, but I don't think it's too hard for students. We'll talk about it. If you feel that that's a course that you really need help with, if you'd like to have a meeting each week where we talk about English grammar or English composition, we can do that. You know what? If you want to cast a vote for any class meetings, just send me an email. Write to mail@classicalliberalarts.com and let me know what you'd be interested in. And if I start to get a lot of the same messages, we'll add some more classes, okay? I have time to do it. It's just a matter of having interest from students, okay? So we can do English studies as well. That's fine. Anything else? Otherwise, we're going to wrap up here. Looks like questions are finished up. So anyway, we're going to wrap up. Thank you for coming. I hope that was helpful. If any questions pop up later on, like they usually do, just send me an email, all right? Can we do classical arithmetic? Like I said, send me messages with classes you're interested in. We'll see what other students say as well, all right? So that's all for today. Tomorrow, we'll meet at the same time for Latin studies if you're interested. And we'll talk about other class meetings. We'll see what everybody wants and find a good set of classes to do. All right. So have a good day. Get to your studies. Get these assignments done. Get tasks done, right? Check boxes. Get tasks done. Submit assignments. Don't just fumble around and spin your tires and waste time. Get assignments done. All right. Get these tasks done. Get through your studies. Okay. I hope that's helpful. God bless everybody. Take care.